Sarah Martinez stepped off the bus at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and determination burning in her dark eyes. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt, but she barely noticed. After months of grueling training at Parris Island, she was finally here, ready to prove herself as a Marine sniper. At 2 years old, Sarah had already faced more challenges than most people twice her age. Growing up in a small Texas town where hunting was as common as breathing, she'd learned to shoot before she could properly ride a bike. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who'd lost his leg to a landmine, had taught her that precision wasn't just about hitting a target. It was about respect, discipline, and understanding the weight of every bullet fired. But being the only daughter among 4 brothers had taught her something else entirely: how to fight for her place in a world that constantly questioned whether she belonged. The Marine Corps had opened combat roles to women just a few years earlier, and Sarah was part of the first wave of female Marines to pursue sniper training. The statistics weren't encouraging. Less than 2% of Marine snipers were women, and the dropout rate during training hovered around 70%. Most instructors still weren't sure what to make of female recruits in their programs. As Sarah made her way to the barracks, she could feel eyes following her every step. Whispered conversations died as she passed, replaced by appraising stares that seemed to weigh her worthiness. She'd grown accustomed to this treatment during basic training, but something about this place felt different, more intense, more skeptical. The sniper school barracks were a far cry from the chaos of boot camp. Here, everything was precise, methodical, almost surgical in its organization. Sarah found her assigned bunk and began unpacking her gear with military efficiency. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar routine while her mind processed the environment around her. Well, what do we have here? The voice behind her carried the distinctive drawl of someone from the deep south, tinged with barely concealed amusement. Sarah turned to face a tall, lean Marine with piercing blue eyes and a smirk that suggested he'd already decided she didn't belong. "Lance Corporal Martinez reporting for sniper training, sir," she replied crisply, maintaining perfect posture despite the informal setting. The Marine laughed, a sound that held no warmth. "Sir? I'm Corporal Jackson, sweetheart, and around here we don't play dress-up with real Marine training." His eyes scanned her from head to toe with obvious disdain. "You sure you're in the right place? The admin building is back that way." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but her expression remained neutral. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, Corporal. Is that right?" Jackson stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "See, here's the thing, darlin'. This ain't some equal opportunity parade. This is where real Marines learn to put bullets exactly where they need to go when lives depend on it. You think you can handle that pressure when some terrorist has your battle buddy in his crosshairs?" Before Sarah could respond, another voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Jackson, you got somewhere else to be?" Both Marines turned to see Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approaching. His weathered face showed no emotion, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he'd been watching the interaction with interest. Rodriguez had 22 years in the Corps, and a chest full of ribbons that told stories most Marines only heard in legends. "Just welcoming our new recruit, Staff Sergeant," Jackson replied, his tone shifting to something more respectful but still carrying an undertone of challenge. "Uh-huh." Rodriguez's gaze fixed on Sarah. "Martinez, right? I've seen your file. Impressive scores from Parris Island." He paused, studying her face. "But scores on paper don't mean much out here. We'll see what you're really made of starting tomorrow." "Looking forward to it, Staff Sergeant." Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but she caught the slightest hint of approval in his eyes before he turned away. "Jackson, my office. Now?" As the two men walked away, Sarah could hear Jackson's voice rising in what sounded like protest, though she couldn't make out the specific words. She returned to unpacking, acutely aware that several other Marines had witnessed the entire exchange. Some looked curious, others skeptical, and a few seemed openly hostile. The rest of the day passed in a blur of administrative processing, equipment checks, and facility tours. Sarah learned that her class consisted of 24 Marines, and she was the only woman. The instructors made no special accommodations for her presence, which she appreciated. but she could feel the constant weight of scrutiny from both staff and fellow students. That evening in the chow hall, Sarah sat alone at a table near the window, mechanically working through her dinner while observing the social dynamics around her. The other students had naturally formed small groups based on their previous units or regional backgrounds. She noticed Jackson holding court at a table of 6 Marines, his animated gestures and their frequent glances in her direction making it clear she was the topic of conversation. "Mind if I sit?" Sarah looked up to see a compact Marine with intelligent brown eyes and a slight smile. His name tape read Chen, and unlike most of the others, he seemed genuinely friendly rather than merely polite. "Go ahead," she replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Chen sat down and immediately began eating, seemingly unbothered by the curious stares their conversation was generating. After a few minutes of comfortable silence, he spoke again. "So, Texas, huh? I grew up in California, but my grandfather had a ranch outside Bakersfield, taught me to shoot when I was 8. He glanced up at her. "Heard you're pretty good with a rifle." Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign of condescension or ulterior motive, but found none. "I do okay. That's not what your file says." Chen's smile widened slightly. 97% accuracy during marksmanship training at Paris Island. That's not okay, that's exceptional. "Files can be misleading," Sarah replied carefully. Chen nodded. "True, but so can first impressions." He gestured subtly toward Jackson's table. "Don't let the politics get in your head. Half these guys are here because they think being a sniper makes them some kind of elite warrior. The other half actually understand what this job requires." He paused. "The question is, which half are you?" Before Sarah could respond, Chen finished his meal and stood up. "Training starts at 05 head tomorrow. Word of advice? Get plenty of sleep. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has a reputation for making the first day unforgettable." As Chen walked away, Sarah found herself alone again with her thoughts. She'd known this assignment would be challenging, but the psychological warfare had begun even before the actual training. Jackson's attitude wasn't unusual. She'd faced similar skepticism throughout her military career. What concerned her more was the subtle pressure she felt to represent all women in combat roles. Every mistake she made would be scrutinized, every success questioned as to whether it was earned or given. She finished her dinner and made her way back to the barracks, where she spent the evening cleaning her gear and reviewing the training manual. The technical aspects of sniper training fascinated her. The mathematics of ballistics, the science of reading weather conditions, the psychology of remaining motionless for hours at a time. These were skills that didn't discriminate based on gender, and she was confident in her ability to master them. The real challenge would be earning the respect of her fellow Marines and instructors through performance rather than politics. Sarah had never been one to back down from a fight, but she'd learned that sometimes the smartest strategy was to let her actions speak louder than any argument. As lights out approached, she lay in her bunk listening to the quiet conversations around her. Most of her fellow students were discussing their previous units, sharing war stories, or speculating about what tomorrow would bring. She remained silent, using the time to mentally prepare for the challenges ahead. Jackson's voice drifted over from a few bunks away, speaking in hushed tones to his nearest neighbors. "Mark my words," he was saying, "she'll wash out within a week. This ain't no place for playing soldier. When the real pressure hits, she'll fold like a house of cards." Sarah closed her eyes and controlled her breathing, a technique her father had taught her for managing stress. Tomorrow would begin the most challenging training of her life, and she needed to be mentally prepared for whatever Rodriguez and the other instructors threw at her. She thought about her father's words from their last conversation before she left for California. "Mija," he'd said, using the Spanish endearment he'd called her since childhood, "you're going to face people who think they know what you're capable of before you even fire a shot. Don't waste energy trying to change their minds with words. Show them who you are through your actions and let the results speak for themselves." The next morning arrived with the jarring sound of reveille at 0430. Sarah was already awake, having conditioned herself to rise early during her years of hunting with her father. While other Marines stumbled through their morning routines, she moved with quiet efficiency, checking her gear one final time before formation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at exactly 0500, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every Marine present. Behind him stood two other instructors, Sergeant First Class Williams, whose massive frame and scarred hands suggested extensive combat experience, and Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, a woman in her mid-30s with steel-gray eyes and a reputation for being one of the most demanding trainers in the Marine Corps. "Welcome to Marine Scout Sniper School," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying easily across the formation without seeming to strain. "For the next 12 weeks, we will break you down and rebuild you into something the Marine Corps desperately needs: invisible ghosts who can reach out and touch our enemies from distances they can't imagine." He began pacing in front of the formation, his eyes making contact with each student as he spoke. "Some of you are here because you think being a sniper makes you special. It doesn't. Some of you are here because you want to be part of an elite unit. That's not what this is about. And some of you," his gaze lingered briefly on Sarah, "are here because you have something to prove." Rodriguez stopped pacing and faced the formation directly. "Here's the truth. I don't care why you're here. I don't care about your previous units, your personal stories, or your motivations. I care about one thing and one thing only. Can you do the job when everything is on the line?" He gestured toward the training facility behind him. "This program has a 70% failure rate. That means 7 out of every 10 Marines standing here right now will not graduate. The training is designed to identify weaknesses and eliminate those who can't meet the standard. There is no curve, no second chances, and no participation trophies." Sarah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as Rodriguez continued his briefing. This was exactly what she'd been preparing for: a pure meritocracy, where only performance mattered. "Your first test begins now," Rodriguez announced. "You will complete a 5-mile run in full gear, followed by a marksmanship assessment at various distances. This is not a competition between each other. This is about meeting the minimum standard required to continue in this program." As the formation dispersed to retrieve their gear, Sarah found herself moving with mechanical precision. Her mind had shifted into the focused state she'd cultivated over years of competitive shooting and military training. The doubts and external pressures faded into background noise, replaced by a singular concentration on the tasks ahead. Jackson passed by her as they headed toward the equipment shed, his shoulder deliberately bumping into hers. "Hope you stretched properly, sweetheart," he muttered under his breath. "This ain't no Sunday jog." Sarah didn't respond, but she filed the comment away with all the others. Eventually, there would come a moment when actions would matter more than words, and she intended to be ready for it. The run itself was brutal but manageable: 5 miles in full gear across varied terrain, with instructors monitoring every step for signs of weakness or failure to maintain proper form. Sarah settled into a steady rhythm, focusing on her breathing and foot placement, rather than the burning sensation in her legs or the weight of her pack. She finished in the top third of the class, neither fast enough to draw unwanted attention nor slow enough to raise concerns about her physical conditioning. Several Marines struggled with the pace, including 2 who had to be helped across the finish line by their classmates. The marksmanship assessment that followed was where Sarah began to show her true capabilities. Using standard M40A5 sniper rifles, each student was required to engage targets at distances ranging from 100 to 800 meters. The scoring was unforgiving. Anything less than expert marksmanship would result in immediate dismissal from the program. Sarah approached the firing line with calm confidence. This was her element, the place where all her training and natural ability converged. She settled into her prone position, adjusting her scope and checking wind conditions with practiced ease. The familiar weight of the rifle felt like an extension of her body, and the world around her faded until only the target remained. Her first shot at 100 meters struck dead center. The second, at 200 meters, was equally precise. As the distances increased, Sarah's performance remained consistent, each bullet finding its mark with mechanical accuracy. She was dimly aware of murmured conversations among the instructors, but her focus never wavered from the task at hand. When the assessment concluded, Sarah had achieved a perfect score across all distances. Several other Marines had performed well, including Chen and 2 others from previous infantry units. Jackson had struggled at the longer ranges, managing to meet the minimum standard but clearly frustrated with his performance. Rodriguez reviewed the scores without comment, then addressed the group. 19 of you met the minimum standard today, 5 did not and will be transferred out of the program immediately. He paused, scanning the faces before him. For those remaining, understand that this was the easy part. Real sniper training begins tomorrow. As the dismissed Marines gathered their gear and prepared to leave, Sarah caught Rodriguez's eye. The staff sergeant's expression remained neutral, but she sensed something that might have been approval. Or perhaps it was simply acknowledgement that she had earned the right to continue. That evening, the atmosphere in the barracks was noticeably different. The group had been reduced to 19 Marines, and the reality of the program's difficulty was settling in. Conversations were quieter, more focused on the technical aspects of what they'd learned rather than bravado or speculation. Jackson approached Sarah's bunk as she was cleaning her rifle, his earlier hostility replaced by something more complex. "Nice shooting today," he said, his tone grudgingly respectful. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah looked up from her weapon, studying Jackson's face for any sign of mockery or ulterior motive. Finding none, she replied simply, "Texas." Jackson nodded slowly. "My granddaddy taught me to hunt when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, but I never saw shooting like that outside of competitions." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "Look, I ain't gonna pretend I think women belong in combat roles, but I respect good marksmanship when I see it." Sarah continued cleaning her rifle, considering her response carefully. "I'm not here to change your mind about women in combat," she finally said. "I'm here to become a Marine sniper." Jackson studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Fair enough." As he turned to walk away, he added, "Just so you know, the real test hasn't started yet. Today was just to see who could handle a rifle. Tomorrow they start messing with your head." Sarah finished cleaning her weapon and prepared for sleep, Jackson's warning echoing in her mind. She'd passed the first hurdle, but she knew he was right about what lay ahead. The physical and technical challenges would only increase, but the psychological pressure would be even more intense. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last conscious thought was of her father's words. "Show them who you are through your actions." Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to do exactly that. Week 3 of sniper training brought a level of intensity that pushed every remaining Marine to their limits. Sarah had survived the initial culling, along with 14 others from the original 19. Each day brought new challenges designed to test not just their shooting ability, but their mental fortitude, physical endurance, and capacity to function under extreme stress. The morning started with what Rodriguez called stress inoculation, a series of exercises designed to simulate the pressure of combat operations. Students were required to engage targets while instructors shouted contradictory commands, played recordings of gunfire and explosions, and randomly introduced equipment failures or time constraints. Sarah lay motionless in the prone position, her M40A5 rifle, trained on a target 600 meters downrange. Sweat dripped steadily from her forehead despite the cool morning air, and her ghillie suit made every movement feel like she was wrapped in a furnace. She'd been holding this position for over an hour, waiting for the specific target to appear among a series of decoys. "Martinez," Sergeant Williams' voice boomed directly behind her. "Target left, 400 meters. You've got 15 seconds before he disappears behind cover." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She smoothly transitioned her rifle to the left, acquired the new target through her scope, and controlled her breathing. The crosshairs settled on the center mass of a silhouette that had appeared for exactly the duration Williams specified. "Time," Williams called out. Sarah maintained her position, waiting for confirmation of her shot placement. This particular exercise had claimed 2 more students the previous day, Marines who had allowed the pressure to break their concentration and rushed their shots. "Dead center," Williams announced after checking through his spotting scope. "Good work." Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before shifting back to her original position. The exercise wasn't over, and any premature relaxation could result in missing the next target sequence. Around her, she could hear the controlled breathing of other Marines engaged in similar challenges at different stations throughout the range. Chen was positioned about 50 meters to her right, working through a different scenario that required him to identify and engage multiple targets in sequence, while dealing with simulated radio chatter and changing wind conditions. His reputation for steady nerves under pressure had proven accurate. He was one of only 3 students who hadn't missed a target during stress exercises. Movement, 300 meters, you're 2 o'clock. Rodriguez's voice came through Sarah's earpiece. Unlike William's deliberate intimidation tactics, Rodriguez preferred to test students with subtle distractions and misdirection. Sarah slowly adjusted her position, scanning through her scope for the movement Rodriguez had indicated. It took nearly 30 seconds of careful observation before she spotted it. A small flag attached to a nearly invisible wire, designed to simulate the kind of minimal movement that might indicate an enemy sniper's position. She settled her crosshairs on the base of the flag and waited. The exercise parameters required her to engage only when she was certain of her target, and hasty shots were penalized more severely than missed opportunities. After another minute of observation, a silhouette target snapped up directly behind the flag position. Sarah's shot was immediate and precise, the bullet striking the target's center mass before it could disappear again. Her follow-through was automatic, working the bolt, acquiring a sight picture for a potential follow-up shot, and scanning for additional threats before relaxing her position. Outstanding. Rodriguez's voice held a note of genuine approval. That's how it's done. The morning's exercises concluded with the remaining 14 Marines gathering around Rodriguez for debrief and evaluation. The attrition rate had stabilized somewhat, but the psychological pressure was clearly taking its toll. Several students showed signs of stress-induced fatigue, and 2 had developed noticeable tremors in their shooting hands. Today we're going to talk about something that separates amateur marksmen from professional snipers, Rodriguez began, settling onto a wooden bench facing the semicircle of students. Any of you can hit a stationary target from a supported position in good weather. That's marksmanship. What we're training you for requires something entirely different. He gestured toward the complex training range behind them, with its multiple target systems, environmental simulation equipment, and stress-inducing audio devices. In combat, you'll be required to make shots that matter under conditions that would make civilian hunters pack up and go home. Rain, wind, extreme temperatures, fatigue, fear, adrenaline, and the knowledge that missing might cost your fellow Marines their lives. Rodriguez's gaze moved from student to student as he spoke. The technical skills we've been teaching you, ballistics calculations, range estimation, wind reading, those are just tools. What makes a sniper effective is the ability to use those tools when everything else is falling apart around you. Jackson raised his hand. Staff Sergeant, how do we know when we're ready for that kind of pressure? I mean, when we're actually capable of handling real combat situations? Rodriguez smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Good question, Jackson. And here's the thing. You don't get to decide when you're ready. The Marine Corps decides based on your performance under conditions designed to replicate the worst possible scenarios. He stood up and began pacing. Which brings us to this afternoon's exercise. Sarah felt a familiar tension building in her stomach. Rodriguez's tone suggested something significantly more challenging than the morning stress tests. For the remainder of this week, you'll be participating in what we call the Unknown Distance Challenge. Rodriguez continued, you'll be given a series of targets at ranges you won't know in advance, under conditions that will change throughout the exercise. Weather, time constraints, equipment limitations, and physical stressors will all be variables. He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. But here's the twist. You'll be working in pairs. One Marine will serve as the shooter, the other as the spotter. Your success or failure will be determined by how well you work together under pressure. The pairings Rodriguez announced were clearly designed to test interpersonal dynamics as much as technical skills. Sarah found herself paired with Jackson, a combination that drew knowing glances from other students and what might have been a slight smirk from Rodriguez himself. Martinez and Jackson, your first scenario begins at 1400 hours, Rodriguez announced. You'll be inserted at an unknown location and given a mission brief at that time. Failure to successfully complete your assigned tasks will result in immediate dismissal from the program. As the group dispersed for lunch and preparation time, Jackson approached Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. Their interactions over the past 3 weeks had evolved from open hostility to grudging professionalism, but she sensed something different in his demeanor now. Look, Jackson began, his characteristic drawl more subdued than usual. I know we ain't exactly been friendly, but this exercise is about more than personal feelings. If we're gonna make it through this, we need to work together. Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign of insincerity or manipulation. What exactly are you suggesting? Jackson glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then continued in a lower voice. Rodriguez paired us up for a reason, and it wasn't to make our lives easier. He wants to see if we can put aside our differences when it matters. He paused. Question is, can you trust me to do my job as your spotter? It was a fair question, and Sarah appreciated his directness. Can you trust me to take the shots when they need to be taken? Jackson was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I reckon I can. You've proven yourself these past few weeks. He extended his hand. Partners? Sarah shook his hand, noting the calluses and steady grip that spoke to years of weapons handling. Partners. The afternoon insertion was conducted via helicopter to a remote section of the base that Sarah had never seen before. The terrain was rough and varied, with dense brush, rocky outcroppings, and limited visibility due to overcast conditions that threatened rain. Rodriguez briefed them as the helicopter prepared for landing. Your target is a high-value individual who will appear at one of 3 possible locations sometime between 1500 and 1700 hours. You'll have 1 shot to neutralize the threat before he disappears. Miss or hesitate, and the mission fails. He handed them a packet containing topographical maps, weather data, and reconnaissance photographs. You have 15 minutes to study this information and develop your plan. Once you're inserted, radio communication will be limited to emergency situations only. Sarah and Jackson spent the flight studying the terrain and discussing their approach. The 3 possible target locations were spread across nearly 2 kilometers of challenging ground, requiring them to position themselves for potential shots at ranges varying from 400 to over 1,000 meters. The high ground here. Jackson pointed to a ridge overlooking 2 of the 3 locations. Gives us the best overall position, but if the target appears at location 3, it's going to be a hell of a shot. Sarah examined the photographs more closely. Location 3 was positioned in a valley nearly 1,200 meters from the ridge, with several potential obstructions that could complicate target identification. What's the alternative? Jackson traced a different route on the map. We could set up here closer to location 3, but then we'd be out of range for the other 2 positions. He looked up at her. It's a gamble either way. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing, and they had less than 30 seconds to grab their gear and exit before it departed. The sudden silence that followed the aircraft's departure was almost disorienting after the constant noise of the flight. Ridge position, Sarah decided. We'll have better visibility and more options if we need to adjust. Jackson nodded his agreement, and they began the carefully planned movement to their chosen position. The approach required nearly an hour of tactical movement, staying low and using available cover to avoid detection by the instructors, who were undoubtedly monitoring their progress. The ridge position offered an excellent view of the surrounding terrain, but the approaching weather was clearly going to complicate their mission. The overcast sky was darkening, and Sarah could smell rain in the air. Wind conditions were also becoming more variable, with gusts that would significantly affect bullet trajectory at longer ranges. They established their hide position with methodical precision, using natural vegetation and their ghillie suits to create effective camouflage. Jackson set up his spotting scope while Sarah prepared her rifle, checking and double-checking every adjustment and setting. 1,500 hours, Jackson whispered, checking his watch. Gain time. For the next 30 minutes, they maintained absolute vigilance, scanning the 3 target locations for any sign of movement. The waiting was perhaps the most challenging part, maintaining focus and readiness while fighting the natural tendency to relax during periods of inactivity. Movement location 2. Jackson's voice was barely audible. Sarah smoothly transitioned her rifle to the indicated position, acquiring a sight picture through her scope. The target was approximately 600 meters away, partially concealed behind a wooden barrier that represented a building corner. I see him, Sarah whispered back. Partial exposure. Center mass shot available. Jackson was already calculating wind and environmental factors, his spotting scope trained on the target area. Wind variable 3 to 5 milliseconds per second from the left. Temperature dropping, visibility decreasing. Sarah waited for the target to present a cleaner shot opportunity. Through her scope, she could see a figure in military clothing positioned to simulate a terrorist leader conducting a meeting. The scenario required her to engage when she had a clear, ethical shot that wouldn't endanger potential civilians in the area. "Clean shot," Jackson confirmed. "You're clear to engage." Sarah controlled her breathing, settling the crosshairs on the target's center mass. Her finger moved to the trigger, applying smooth, steady pressure as she'd been trained. The world seemed to narrow to just the target, and her rifle, everything else fading into irrelevance. The shot broke cleanly, and through her scope, Sarah could see the immediate impact. The target went down, and Jackson confirmed the hit through his spotting scope. "Target down," he reported. "Clean hit, center mass." They maintained their position for several more minutes, as the exercise parameters required them to observe for additional threats or mission complications. Only when Rodriguez's voice came through their radio with "exercise complete, return to base" did they begin breaking down their position. The movement back to the extraction point was conducted with the same care as their initial insertion. Even though the primary mission was complete, the exercise evaluation continued until they were physically back at the base facility. Rodriguez was waiting for them at the range office, along with Gunnery Sergeant Morrison and another instructor Sarah didn't recognize. His expression was unreadable as they reported for debrief. "Time from insertion to successful target neutralization. 2 hours, 18 minutes. Rodriguez began, consulting his notes. "Shot placement, center mass, clean kill. Mission parameters, successfully achieved." He looked up at both Marines. "Questions or concerns about your performance?" Jackson and Sarah exchanged glances before Jackson spoke. "No, Staff Sergeant. We followed our planned approach and executed as trained." Rodriguez nodded. "Morrison, your assessment?" Gunnery Sergeant Morrison stepped forward, her steel-gray eyes fixed on Sarah. "Technically proficient execution, good teamwork and communication, appropriate tactical movement and position selection." She paused. "However, the real test isn't hitting targets under controlled conditions." Sarah felt a familiar tension building. Morrison's reputation included a particular focus on psychological evaluation of students under stress. "Starting tomorrow, we'll be conducting live fire exercises with significantly more realistic stress factors," Morrison continued. "Multiple targets, time constraints, equipment failures, and psychological pressure designed to simulate actual combat conditions." She gestured toward the door. "Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow we find out who among you has what it takes to be a Marine sniper when everything is on the line." As Sarah and Jackson walked back to the barracks, there was a noticeable shift in the dynamic between them. The successful completion of their first paired exercise had established a foundation of mutual respect that neither had expected. "You did good out there," Jackson said as they reached the barracks entrance. "Clean shooting, good judgment on target engagement." Sarah nodded her acknowledgement. "You called the wind perfectly, made it possible." Jackson was quiet for a moment, then spoke again. "You know, when this program started, I figured you'd wash out within a week. Not because you couldn't shoot, but because I didn't think you could handle the pressure." He paused. "I was wrong." That evening, Sarah found herself reflecting on the day's events and the challenges that lay ahead. The technical aspects of sniper training continued to play to her strengths, but the psychological dimensions were becoming increasingly complex. Morrison's warnings about realistic stress factors suggested that the real test of her capabilities was yet to come. Chen stopped by her bunk as she was cleaning her rifle, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the common area. "Heard your exercise went well today," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Thanks." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. "How was your scenario?" Chen grimaced slightly. "Challenging. My partner and I had to engage multiple targets in sequence while dealing with simulated artillery fire and smoke obscuration." He sat down on the adjacent bunk. "We made it through, but it was close." Morrison wasn't kidding about ramping up the pressure. Sarah sipped her coffee, considering Chen's words. "What do you think tomorrow will bring?" "Based on what I've heard from Marines who went through this program before," Chen replied, "tomorrow is when they really start messing with our heads. Equipment failures, impossible time constraints, scenarios designed to make us doubt our training and instincts." As if on cue, Rodriguez appeared in the barracks doorway. "Listen up, people. Tomorrow's exercise begins at 0400 hours. You'll be awakened at 0330 and given mission briefs immediately. No preparation time, no equipment checks beyond what you can do in the field. He scanned the faces of the remaining students. Some of you won't be coming back. After Rodriguez left, the barracks fell into an unusually quiet atmosphere. The remaining 14 Marines were all acutely aware that they were approaching the most challenging phase of their training. Several students were clearly struggling with stress, and the psychological pressure was visible in their facial expressions and body language. Sarah lay in her bunk that night, running through mental exercises her father had taught her for managing pre-competition nerves. Tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't fully anticipate, but her training and natural abilities had carried her this far. The question now was whether they would be enough when everything was designed to break her concentration and confidence. As she drifted off to sleep, she could hear quiet conversations around her, students sharing encouragement, discussing technical points, or simply trying to process their own anxiety about what lay ahead. The camaraderie that had developed among the survivors was genuine, but everyone understood that individual performance would ultimately determine who remained in the program. Jackson's voice came from the bunk across the aisle, barely audible in the darkened barracks. "Martinez, thanks for today. You held up your end." Sarah smiled in the darkness. "You too, Jackson. See you in the morning." Tomorrow would bring the true test of everything they'd learned, and Sarah was as ready as she could possibly be. 0330 came like a thunderbolt, shattering sleep with the harsh sound of emergency whistles. Sarah's eyes snapped open instantly, her military conditioning overriding the natural disorientation of sudden awakening. Around her, the barracks erupted into controlled chaos as 14 Marines scrambled to dress and prepare for whatever challenge awaited them. "Move, move, move!" Sergeant Williams' voice boomed through the building. Full gear, weapons, ready for insertion in 10 minutes. No time for coffee, no time for breakfast, no time for anything except proving you deserve to be here. Sarah's hands moved with automatic precision through her pre-mission routine, checking equipment and adjusting gear, while her mind processed the implications of this early start. The instructors were clearly implementing psychological pressure from the very beginning, denying students the normal preparation rituals that helped manage stress and anxiety. Jackson was moving with similar efficiency across the aisle, his earlier nervousness replaced by the focused intensity she'd come to associate with his better performances. Chen, positioned near the door, was already fully dressed and conducting final equipment checks with mechanical precision. "Buses outside in 5 minutes." Williams continued his countdown. "Any Marine not ready for transport will be dropped from the program immediately." Sarah shouldered her rifle and pack, conducting a final mental inventory of her essential equipment. The instructors had deliberately created time pressure that made thorough preparation impossible, forcing students to rely on their training and instinctive responses rather than careful planning. The bus ride to the unknown exercise location was conducted in complete silence, with blackout curtains preventing students from seeing their destination. The psychological impact was deliberate, removing familiar reference points and increasing uncertainty about what they would face upon arrival. Rodriguez stood at the front of the bus, his expression giving no hint of what lay ahead. "In 30 minutes, you'll be conducting live fire exercises under conditions designed to replicate the worst possible combat scenarios," he announced. "Equipment failures, multiple target engagements, extreme time constraints, and psychological stressors that will test everything you've learned." He paused, studying the faces of the students. 3 of you will not complete today's exercises successfully. Those Marines will be transferred out of the program immediately. The implications hung in the air like a physical weight. "You'll be working individually today," Rodriguez continued. "No spotters, no partners, no backup support. Just you, your weapon, and your training against scenarios designed by Marines who've done this job in actual combat situations." Sarah felt her stomach tighten slightly, but her breathing remained controlled and steady. Individual performance meant no one else could compensate for her mistakes, but it also meant her success or failure would be entirely her own responsibility. The bus stopped at what appeared to be a completely different section of the base, with terrain Sarah didn't recognize and facilities that looked more like a military operations center than a training range. Multiple helicopters were visible in the distance, and she could hear the sound of simulated explosions and gunfire from somewhere beyond the immediate area. "Martinez," Rodriguez called out as students began exiting the bus. "You're up first. Report to the briefing tent immediately." Sarah felt every eye on her as she separated from the group and approached the designated tent. Being selected first could be either an advantage or a significant disadvantage, depending on the nature of the exercise and whether subsequent students would benefit from observing her performance. Inside the briefing tent, Gunnery Sergeant Morrison waited with a detailed map spread across a folding table. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah sensed an intensity that suggested today's challenges would exceed anything they'd faced previously. "Sit down, Martinez." Morrison gestured to a chair across from her. "You have exactly 3 minutes to review this scenario and develop your approach. No questions, no clarification, no additional information beyond what's on this table." Sarah studied the materials with focused intensity. The scenario involved a hostage situation in a simulated urban environment with multiple buildings, potential civilian locations, and a terrorist leader who would appear at one of several possible positions. The challenge was complicated by the fact that the target would be moving between locations, requiring rapid assessment and engagement decisions. Time constraints. You have 15 minutes from insertion to successful target neutralization, Morrison continued. Equipment limitation. Your rifle scope has been deliberately damaged to simulate combat conditions. Psychological stressor. Recorded gunfire and explosions will be played throughout the exercise to simulate ongoing combat operations. Sarah felt her adrenaline surge as she processed the implications. A damaged scope would require her to rely on backup iron sights or compensate for optical distortion. Moving targets would demand split-second decision-making, and the audio distractions would test her ability to maintain concentration under combat-like stress. "One more thing," Morrison added, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are civilian targets mixed throughout the scenario. Engaging a non-combatant will result in immediate failure and dismissal from the program." The weight of that statement settled over Sarah like a physical force. "Transport leaves in 30 seconds, Morrison announced, checking her watch. "Good luck, Marine." Sarah was led to a helicopter already spinning up for immediate departure. No time for additional preparation, no opportunity to test her damaged equipment, no chance to mentally rehearse her approach beyond the brief planning time she'd been given. The flight to the exercise area lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours as Sarah ran through potential scenarios and tactical considerations. The damaged scope would require her to either rely on iron sights for precision work or find ways to compensate for whatever optical distortion had been introduced. The insertion point was a small clearing approximately 800 meters from the simulated urban area where her target would appear. The moment her feet hit the ground, the helicopter departed, leaving her alone with the mission and a ticking clock that had already begun counting down her 15 minutes. Sarah immediately began moving toward the urban area, using available cover and maintaining situational awareness, while mentally cataloging potential shooting positions and sightlines. The recorded combat sounds began almost immediately. Realistic gunfire, explosions, and shouted commands that created an almost overwhelming audio environment. Her first priority was finding an elevated position that would provide clear fields of fire to the multiple locations where her target might appear. The damaged scope revealed itself to be cracked across the center, creating distortion that would make precise target identification extremely challenging. Sarah settled into a position on the second floor of a partially constructed building, giving her sight lines to 3 of the 4 possible target locations. Through her damaged scope, she could see movement in the urban area below, but identifying specific individuals was significantly more difficult than anticipated. "Multiple contacts moving between buildings," she whispered to herself, falling back on the self-communication techniques she'd been taught for solo operations. "Civilian clothing mixed with military uniforms. Need positive target identification before engagement." The audio chaos continued around her, with realistic battle sounds that seemed designed to induce the kind of auditory overload that could cause mistakes in target identification. Sarah forced herself to focus on visual cues rather than the distracting noise, using breathing techniques to maintain concentration. Movement in her primary target area caught her attention. a figure in military clothing moving with purpose between two buildings. Through her damaged scope, she could make out enough detail to suggest this might be her target, but the optical distortion made positive identification impossible at this range. Sarah shifted to her backup iron sights, accepting the reduced precision in exchange for clear target identification capabilities. The range was approximately 400 meters, well within her capabilities using iron sights, but the moving target and time pressure added significant complexity to the shot. The figure paused in an open area between buildings, and Sarah could finally see enough detail for positive identification. Military uniform, command posture, and positioning that matched the briefing photographs. This was her target. She settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing, and waited for the optimal shot opportunity. The target was moving predictably between cover positions, giving her a narrow window for engagement when he paused to observe the surrounding area. Through her iron sights, Sarah tracked the target's movement pattern, calculating the timing for her shot opportunity. The background was clear of civilians, and she had positive identification of her target. When he paused at the predicted position, she smoothly squeezed the trigger. The shot broke cleanly, and through her scope she could see the immediate impact. The target went down, and there was no movement suggesting he was still a threat. Sarah maintained her position for 30 seconds, observing for additional targets or complications before acknowledging that the mission was complete. Target neutralized, she reported into her radio, following the exercise protocols she'd memorized. Exercise complete. Rodriguez's voice came back immediately. Return to extraction point for debrief. The walk back to the extraction point gave Sarah time to process what had just occurred. The combination of equipment failure, time pressure, audio distraction, and the risk of civilian casualties had created the most challenging shooting scenario she'd ever faced. Her success felt significant, but she was acutely aware that this was just the first of what would likely be increasingly difficult tests. Rodriguez was waiting at the extraction point with Morrison and another instructor Sarah hadn't met previously. Their expressions were unreadable as she approached for debrief. Time from insertion to target neutralization. 11 minutes 47 seconds, Rodriguez announced, consulting his stopwatch. Shot placement, center mass, immediate incapacitation. Civilian safety, no non-combatant casualties. He looked up at her. Mission parameters successfully achieved. Morrison stepped forward, her evaluation more detailed. Good adaptation to equipment failure, appropriate use of backup sites. Solid target identification procedures under stress. She paused. However, your initial positioning could have been more advantageous. You were limited to 3 target areas instead of having full coverage. Sarah nodded her acknowledgement. Morrison was right, her position selection had been influenced by time pressure rather than optimal tactical considerations. In a real combat situation, that limitation could have had serious consequences. Return to base and await further instructions, Rodriguez concluded. Your next exercise will be scheduled based on how the remaining students perform today. As Sarah was transported back to the main facility, she could see other students being prepared for their individual exercises. The stress was visible on every face. The knowledge that 3 Marines would not return from today's challenges weighed heavily on everyone's mind. Jackson was among those still waiting for his turn, and Sarah caught his eye as she passed. She gave him a slight nod, not celebration but acknowledgement that she'd made it through the first challenge. His return nod carried the same message of mutual respect they'd developed over the past few weeks. Back at the barracks, Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being alone while her fellow students faced their individual trials. She used the time to clean and inspect her equipment, review the lessons learned from her exercise, and mentally prepare for whatever additional challenges the day might bring. The waiting was almost more stressful than the actual exercise had been. Without immediate tasks to focus on, her mind began analyzing every aspect of her performance, identifying mistakes and areas for improvement. The damaged scope scenario had been challenging but manageable. She suspected the remaining exercises would only increase in difficulty. Chen returned 3 hours later, his expression grim but determined. He nodded to Sarah but didn't offer any details about his exercise. The instructors had made it clear that discussing specific scenarios with students who hadn't completed them yet was grounds for dismissal. Jackson returned in the late afternoon, followed by 2 other Marines who looked exhausted but relieved. As evening approached, it became clear that not all 14 students would be returning. Rodriguez appeared in the barracks at 1800 hours with the final accounting. 11 Marines successfully completed today's individual exercises, he announced without preamble. 3 did not meet the standard and have been transferred out of the program. The loss of 3 more students brought their number down to 11 from the original 24. Sarah felt a mixture of relief at her own survival and genuine regret for the Marines who'd been eliminated. Each departure meant fewer familiar faces and increased pressure on those who remained. "Tomorrow we begin Phase 4 of your training," Rodriguez continued. "Advanced field craft, camouflage and concealment, and extended surveillance operations. You'll be spending the next week in field conditions with minimal food, water, and sleep while conducting complex reconnaissance missions." He paused, scanning the faces of the remaining students. "This is where we separate Marines who can shoot accurately from Marines who can function as professional snipers in actual combat operations. The failure rate for this phase historically runs around 50%. Sarah felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through every previous challenge. 11 Marines remained, which meant statistically 5 or 6 would not complete the next phase successfully. The mathematics were daunting, but her confidence in her own capabilities remained unshaken. That evening, the remaining students gathered informally to discuss what lay ahead. The conversation was subdued but supportive. Everyone understood they were competing for limited slots, but the shared experience of surviving this far had created genuine bonds of mutual respect. Field operations played to different strengths than range work, Chen observed quietly. Patience, physical endurance, psychological resilience under extended stress. Some of the best marksmen never make it through this phase. Jackson nodded his agreement. "My uncle went through sniper school back in the 80s. He said the shooting was the easy part. It was the mind games and sleep deprivation that broke most people." Sarah listened to their discussion while mentally inventorying her own strengths and weaknesses for extended field operations. Growing up hunting in Texas had given her significant experience with patience, camouflage, and remaining motionless for extended periods. Her physical conditioning was solid, and her psychological resilience had been tested repeatedly throughout the program. "What about you, Martinez?" Chen asked. "You worried about next week?" Sarah considered her response carefully. "I'm concerned about the challenge level, but I think my background prepared me pretty well for this kind of work." She paused. "The real question is whether any of us are prepared for whatever psychological games they're planning to play with our heads." Rodriguez's words from earlier suggested that Phase 4 would involve more than just technical fieldcraft skills. The phrase, mind games, suggested deliberate psychological pressure designed to break concentration and induce mistakes under stress. As lights out approached, Sarah found herself reflecting on how far she'd come since arriving at Camp Pendleton 7 weeks earlier. The hostile reception from Jackson had evolved into genuine partnership and mutual respect. Its constant, "Bring peace to the trees before anyone else. This is the book, it's about history." Her own capabilities had been tested and proven under such an answer. This is the book, it's about history. Her own capabilities had been tested and proven under such an answer. The 11 remaining Marines represented the survivors of a selection process designed to identify the most capable candidates for one of the military's most demanding specialties. Tomorrow would begin the final phase of testing extended operations under field conditions that would challenge every aspect of their training and personal resilience. Sarah closed her eyes and began the mental preparation routine her father had taught her years earlier. Visualization of successful performance, controlled breathing to manage stress, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing she'd prepared as thoroughly as possible for the challenges ahead. Phase 4 would test whether she could maintain her high-performance standards under extended stress, sleep deprivation, and psychological pressure. She'd made it this far through preparation, determination, and natural ability. Tomorrow would reveal whether those qualities were enough to carry her through to graduation. Day 5 of Phase 4 found Sarah lying motionless in a carefully constructed hide position, her body pressed against the earth beneath a canopy of vegetation that had taken her 3 hours to properly arrange. She had been in this exact position for over 18 hours, observing a simulated enemy compound through her spotting scope while recording detailed intelligence about patrol patterns, defensive positions, and potential targets. Her ghillie suit had become a second skin, incorporating local vegetation that helped her blend seamlessly into the surrounding terrain. Every movement was calculated and deliberate. Even shifting to relieve muscle cramps required careful consideration to avoid detection by the instructors, who were actively hunting for hidden students throughout the exercise area. The mission parameters were deceptively simple. Maintain surveillance on the target compound for 72 hours. Record detailed intelligence about enemy activities, and remain undetected by roving security patrols. Simple in concept, brutal in execution. Sarah's stomach had stopped growling after the second day, and the constant low-level hunger had become background noise she could largely ignore. Water discipline was critical. She had a limited supply that needed to last the entire exercise, and opportunities for resupply were both rare and dangerous. Through her spotting scope, she observed the daily routines that had become familiar over the past several days. Guard rotations every 4 hours, supply deliveries at irregular intervals, and the movement patterns of high-value targets who appeared according to schedules she'd gradually learned to predict. Her observation log was filled with detailed notes written in the abbreviated code all snipers learned for recording intelligence data, timestamps, personnel counts, equipment descriptions, and behavioral patterns that would be analyzed after the exercise to determine the quality of intelligence she'd gathered. A slight rustling in the vegetation 50 meters to her left caused Sarah to freeze completely. Through peripheral vision, she could detect movement that suggested one of the instructor hunters was conducting a detailed search of her general area. Being discovered would mean immediate failure and elimination from the program. She controlled her breathing to the point where her chest movement was virtually undetectable, a technique that required conscious effort after hours of maintaining such control. Her heart rate slowed through mental discipline, and she entered the almost meditative state that allowed her to remain motionless for extended periods. The searching instructor moved closer, his careful examination of potential hiding spots indicating he suspected someone was positioned in this area. Sarah could hear his footsteps now, the deliberate placement of each step as he probed the vegetation, looking for signs of human presence. He passed within 10 feet of her position, so close she could have reached out and touched his boot. Sarah's camouflage and fieldcraft held, the instructor completed his search pattern and moved away without detecting her presence. Only after his footsteps had faded completely did she allow herself to breathe normally again. This was the third time in 5 days that search teams had come close to discovering her position. Each near miss was both a validation of her concealment skills and a reminder of how precarious her situation remained. The psychological pressure of potential discovery was constant, requiring mental discipline that was almost as demanding as the physical challenges. Through her scope, Sarah observed the afternoon guard rotation beginning at the compound. This was the time period when her primary target typically appeared, a simulated enemy commander whose elimination would be her final test if she successfully completed the surveillance phase. The target appeared on schedule, moving between buildings with the confident bearing that made him identifiable among the other personnel in the compound. Sarah tracked his movement pattern, noting the timing and routes he used for his daily inspection of security positions. Her mission would transition from surveillance to direct action tomorrow morning, when she would have a single opportunity to engage this target under conditions that would test every skill she'd developed over the past 10 weeks. Miss a shot or compromise her position, and months of training would end in failure. But first she had to survive. One more night in her hide position, while maintaining the vigilance required to gather intelligence and avoid detection. The temperature would drop significantly after sunset, adding another layer of physical discomfort to the mental challenges she was already managing. As evening approached, Sarah conducted her routine equipment check by feel alone. Visual inspection would require movement that might compromise her position. Her rifle was clean and ready, her ammunition secure, and her observation equipment functioning properly, despite days of exposure to moisture and temperature variations. The compound's activity level decreased after sunset, but Sarah's vigilance remained constant. Night operations were when enemy forces often conducted their most sensitive activities, and missing critical intelligence due to fatigue or relaxed attention could result in mission failure. Through her night vision scope, she observed vehicle movements that hadn't occurred during daylight hours. Supply trucks arrived under cover of darkness, and personnel movements suggested shift changes or operational planning that could be significant intelligence indicators. Sarah documented everything with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd maintained throughout the exercise. Her observation log would be evaluated not just for accuracy, but for completeness and tactical relevance. Missing important details could be just as damaging to her final score as being detected by security patrols. The night passed with agonizing slowness, each hour marked by position adjustments so subtle they were barely perceptible, even to her. Muscle cramps, joint stiffness, and the constant mental effort required to maintain alertness while fighting fatigue created a cumulative stress that tested her physical and psychological limits. Dawn brought renewed activity at the compound, and the knowledge that this would be her final day in the field. Either she would successfully complete her mission and return to base, or she would join the 5 other Marines who had been eliminated during Phase 4. The attrition rate had been even higher than Rodriguez had predicted. Of the 11 Marines who began the extended field exercise, only 6 remained. Chen had been eliminated on day 2 when instructors discovered his hide position during a security sweep. Jackson had made it through 4 days before missing a critical intelligence indicator that resulted in mission failure. Sarah was acutely aware that her performance over the next few hours would determine whether months of training culminated in success or failure. The margin for error was essentially 0. Every decision, every movement, every shot had to be executed flawlessly. Through her scope, she observed the morning routines at the compound while mentally rehearsing her engagement plan. The target would appear sometime between 0800 and 0900 hours, based on patterns she'd identified over the previous days. Her shooting position was already prepared, and environmental conditions were favorable for accurate long-range fire. At 0837, her target emerged from the main building and began his routine inspection of perimeter positions. Sarah smoothly transitioned from her spotting scope to her rifle scope, settling into the precise shooting position she'd practiced countless times over the past weeks. The range was 847 meters, confirmed through multiple measurement techniques during her hide construction. Wind conditions were light and variable, requiring careful observation of vegetation, movement, and other environmental indicators to judge bullet trajectory. Sarah's crosshairs settled on her target as he paused at a predictable checkpoint in his patrol route. Her breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm that preceded precision shots, and her finger found the trigger with the gentle pressure that would break the shot cleanly. The target was in perfect position, clear background, no obstructions, no civilians or friendly forces in the area. This was the shot that would determine whether she became a Marine sniper or returned to her previous unit with the knowledge that she hadn't quite measured up to the demanding standards of the program. Sarah's world narrowed to just the target and her rifle, the discomfort of 5 days in the field, the pressure of constant evaluation, the knowledge that this was her single opportunity. All of it faded into background noise as her training took over. Her finger applied steady rearward pressure to the trigger, the careful squeeze that would send her bullet across nearly half a mile to find its target. The shot broke with textbook precision, and through her scope, she watched the bullet impact exactly where her crosshairs had been positioned. The target went down immediately, the clean hit confirming successful completion of what had been the most challenging test of her life. Sarah maintained her shooting position for 60 seconds, observing for any additional threats or complications before transmitting her mission completion report. Target neutralized, she reported over her radio, using the abbreviated format required for tactical communications. Exercise complete. Rodriguez's voice responded immediately. Remain in position for extraction team. Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction before beginning the methodical process of preparing for extraction. 5 days in the field culminated in a single shot that validated everything she'd learned and endured during the most demanding training of her military career. The extraction team arrived within minutes, led by Rodriguez and Morrison, who had monitored every aspect of her performance during the extended exercise. Their expressions were carefully neutral as they approached her hide position, giving no indication of their evaluation. Outstanding concealment work, Morrison commented as she examined Sarah's hide construction. Professional-grade field craft, excellent intelligence gathering, and textbook target engagement. She paused, studying Sarah's face. How do you feel about your performance?
Sarah considered the question carefully.
I accomplished the mission as briefed, Staff Sergeant. The intelligence gathering phase went according to plan, and the target engagement was successful. Rodriguez stepped forward, his evaluation more comprehensive. 73 hours in hide position without detection, detailed intelligence log with over 200 separate observations, and a successful engagement at 847 meters under field conditions. He paused. That represents the standard we expect from Marine snipers. As they made their way back to base, Sarah learned that only 4 Marines had successfully completed the extended field exercise. 2 others had been eliminated when their final target engagements failed to meet the required standard for accuracy or tactical execution. The return to base facilities felt surreal after 5 days in field conditions. Hot showers, regular meals, and sleeping in an actual bunk seemed like luxury accommodations after her extended time in the hide position. That evening, Rodriguez assembled the 4 remaining students for their final evaluation and program completion ceremony. From 24 Marines who had begun sniper training 10 weeks earlier, only 4 had successfully completed every phase of the demanding curriculum. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez began, his formal tone indicating the significance of the moment, "you are now qualified Marine Scout snipers. You have demonstrated the technical skills, physical endurance, and psychological resilience required to serve in one of the most demanding roles in the Marine Corps." He gestured toward the certificates and insignia arranged on the table behind him. "Your training here represents the beginning, not the end, of your development as Marine snipers. The real test will come when you apply these skills in actual combat situations where lives depend on your performance." Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment as she received her sniper qualification certificate and the distinctive Scout Sniper insignia. Months of training, physical and mental challenges that had eliminated 20 other Marines, and the constant pressure to prove herself had culminated in this moment. But Rodriguez's words about real combat applications reminded her that graduation was indeed just the beginning. Everything she'd learned would be tested under conditions where the stakes were life and death rather than career advancement. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. From the initial skepticism she'd faced from instructors and fellow students, through the gradual earning of respect based on performance, to the final validation of her capabilities under the most demanding conditions. Jackson's prediction that she would wash out within a week seemed like a distant memory now. The Marine who had questioned her place in the program had become a partner and ultimately a friend, though he hadn't made it through the final phases himself. Chen approached her after the ceremony, his congratulations genuine, despite his own elimination from the program. "You earned this," he said simply. "I watched you handle every challenge they threw at you, and you never let the pressure break your focus." Sarah appreciated his words, but her mind was already turning toward the future. As a newly qualified Marine sniper, she would be assigned to an operational unit where her training would be put to use in real-world situations. The thought both excited and sobered her. Everything she'd endured during the past 10 weeks had been preparation for missions where her skills would protect fellow Marines and serve national security objectives. The responsibility that came with her new qualification was immense. That night, Sarah called her father from the base phone system, sharing the news of her graduation with the man who had first taught her to shoot and instilled in her the values that had carried her through the program. "I'm proud of you, mija." His voice carried clearly over the distance between California and Texas. "You've accomplished something remarkable, and you've done it the right way, through hard work and determination." As Sarah prepared for sleep on her final night at sniper school, she felt the satisfaction of goals achieved and challenges overcome. Tomorrow would bring new assignments, new responsibilities, and new tests of the skills she'd developed. But tonight, she was simply a Marine who had earned her place among the elite few qualified to serve as a scout sniper, ready to take the next step in a career that would demand everything she had learned and everything she had yet to learn. 6 months after graduating from sniper school, Lance Corporal Sarah Martinez found herself deployed to a remote forward operating base in Afghanistan, where the theoretical knowledge and training scenarios of Camp Pendleton would face their ultimate test in actual combat operations. Forward Operating Base Chapman was a dusty collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and defensive positions carved into the mountainous terrain of eastern Afghanistan. The base served as a launching point for special operations missions and provided security for critical supply routes through the volatile region. Sarah's assignment to the base's sniper team had been met with the same skepticism she'd encountered throughout her career, amplified by the combat environment where mistakes could have lethal consequences for entire units. The team leader, Staff Sergeant David Torres, was a veteran with 3 previous deployments and little patience for Marines who hadn't proven themselves under fire. "Martinez, you'll be working with Corporal Williams as your spotter until you demonstrate you can handle the pressure of actual combat operations," Torres had explained during her initial briefing. "This ain't training anymore. Miss a shot out here and people die." Williams was a soft-spoken Marine from Alabama whose calm demeanor masked the intensity that had made him one of the most effective spotters in the battalion. His previous sniper partner had been wounded during a Taliban ambush 2 months earlier, and he'd been working solo missions until Sarah's arrival. Their first week together involved familiarization patrols and observation posts that allowed Sarah to adapt to the operational environment, while Williams evaluated her capabilities. The terrain was unlike anything she'd trained on. Extreme elevation changes, unpredictable weather patterns, and wind conditions that could change dramatically within minutes. "The textbook don't mean much out here," Williams explained, as they established an observation post overlooking a valley suspected of Taliban activity. "Every shot is different because every situation is different. You got to read the environment and trust your instincts." Sarah appreciated Williams's practical approach to field instruction. Unlike some Marines who viewed female snipers as experimental additions to combat units, Williams seemed genuinely interested in developing an effective partnership based on complementary skills and mutual trust. Their first combat engagement came during their second week of operations, when their patrol was tasked with providing overwatch for a convoy moving through a high-risk valley. Sarah and Williams positioned themselves on a ridgeline approximately 1,200 meters from the primary route, with clear sight lines to potential ambush positions. The Taliban attack began at 13:47 hours, with coordinated fire from multiple positions designed to trap the convoy in a kill zone. RPGs and automatic weapons fire erupted from concealed positions, and the convoy's return fire filled the valley with the sounds of intense combat. "Multiple targets, your 10 o'clock, approximately 800 meters." Williams's voice was calm despite the chaos below them. 3 shooters with automatic weapons, positioned behind the rock outcropping. Sarah smoothly transitioned her rifle toward the indicated position, acquiring a sight picture through her scope while Williams calculated range and environmental factors. This was the moment she'd trained for. Actual combat engagement where her performance would directly impact the survival of fellow Marines. Through her scope, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the Taliban position, their weapons directed at the pinned convoy below. The range was challenging but well within her capabilities, and the environmental conditions were favorable for accurate fire. "Range 847 meters, wind negligible, you're clear to engage," Williams confirmed, his spotting scope trained on the target area. Sarah's first combat shot broke cleanly, the bullet traveling across the valley to strike one of the Taliban fighters' center mass. Her follow-up shot eliminated a second target before the remaining fighters could identify the source of the incoming fire. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, but its impact on the convoy's survival was significant. With the primary ambush position neutralized, the Marines below could maneuver to safety while calling in additional support to clear remaining threats. "Nice shooting, Martinez." Williams's evaluation was matter-of-fact rather than congratulatory. "Clean hits, good target priority, professional execution." As they prepared to relocate to avoid counterfire, Sarah felt the complex mix of emotions that came with successful combat engagement. Pride in her technical performance was tempered by the reality that she'd taken lives in service of protecting fellow Marines. That evening, Torres debriefed their engagement with the detailed analysis that characterized post-mission evaluations. "Textbook sniper employment," he concluded after reviewing their actions and results. "You demonstrated exactly what we need from this position." Over the following weeks, Sarah and Williams developed the kind of partnership that made sniper teams effective in combat operations. Their complementary skills and growing trust allowed them to function as a single unit, with Williams' experience and Sarah's exceptional marksmanship creating a formidable capability. But it was during their 7th week of deployment that Sarah would face the challenge that would define her reputation within the special operations community and demonstrate capabilities that even her instructors at sniper school hadn't anticipated. The mission began as a routine reconnaissance patrol, tasked with observing Taliban movement patterns in a valley system that had become increasingly active. Intelligence reports suggested the area was being used as a staging ground for attacks against coalition forces, and Sarah's team was positioned to gather detailed information about enemy capabilities and intentions. Their observation post was established on a ridgeline that provided excellent visibility across multiple valleys, allowing them to monitor several potential routes simultaneously. The position also offered concealment and multiple avenues for extraction if their presence was discovered by enemy forces. On the morning of their 3rd day in position, Williams spotted movement that immediately captured their attention. Through his spotting scope, he could see a convoy of vehicles moving along a route that intelligence had identified as a high-value target corridor. Vehicle movement, your 2 o'clock, range approximately 2,100 meters. Williams reported, his voice carrying a note of excitement. 3 vehicles moving tactical formation, possible HVT convoy. Sarah adjusted her rifle toward the indicated position, though she knew immediately that 2,100 meters was beyond the effective range of standard sniper engagements. Most combat shots were taken at ranges under 800 meters, and anything beyond 1,200 meters was considered extremely long range even under ideal conditions. Through her scope, Sarah could barely make out the vehicles Williams had identified. At that distance, individual personnel were essentially invisible, and environmental factors would make accurate fire nearly impossible under normal circumstances. That's way outside normal engagement range, Sarah observed, continuing to monitor the distant convoy. Even if we can identify specific targets, the probability of hit at that distance is pretty low. Williams was studying the vehicles more intently through his higher-powered spotting scope. "Hold on a minute," he said, his tone shifting to something more urgent. "I think that's not just any convoy." For several minutes, Williams observed the distant vehicles while Sarah maintained overwatch of their immediate area for potential threats. The Taliban had demonstrated sophisticated counter-surveillance capabilities, and sniper teams were high-priority targets for their forces. "Martinez, you need to see this," Williams finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Middle vehicle, passenger side. I think that's Khalid Hassan." Sarah felt her adrenaline spike at the mention of that name. Hassan was one of the most wanted Taliban commanders in the region, responsible for multiple attacks against coalition forces and a primary target for special operations missions. Confirming his presence would be significant intelligence, but engaging at that range would be nearly impossible. Through her scope, Sarah could barely distinguish individual figures near the vehicles, much less identify specific personnel. "I can't make positive identification at this range," she reported. "Even if it is Hassan, we're talking about an engagement beyond anything we've trained for." Williams continued his detailed observation through the spotting scope, occasionally making notes about vehicle positions and personnel movement. After several more minutes, he spoke again with greater certainty. "I'm 90% confident that's Hassan," he stated. "Vehicle positioning, security arrangement, and individual movement patterns all match intelligence descriptions." He paused. "Question is, do we have any chance of making this shot?" Sarah considered the tactical situation carefully. The range was extreme, environmental conditions were challenging, and positive target identification was marginal at best. Every principle of sniper employment suggested this was not a viable engagement opportunity. But Hassan's elimination would significantly impact Taliban operations in the region, and potentially save countless coalition lives. If there was any possibility of success, the attempt might be justified, despite the overwhelming challenges. "Range 2,187 meters, Sarah announced after conducting her own calculations. Variable wind conditions, temperature differential, and target movement make this a probability shot at best. Williams was already calculating environmental factors, his experience with long-range ballistics evident in his systematic approach to the problem. Wind is the biggest variable, he concluded, gusting between 5 and 12 miles per hour from multiple directions. Bullet flight time will be over 3.